In 1856, a man named Henry Bibb wrote about the moment that broke him. He watched as an overseer whipped his 7-year-old daughter for working too slowly in the field. He stood 20 feet away. He was her father, and he could do nothing. If he intervened, both he and his daughter would receive worse punishment. If he tried to protect her, they might both be sold away. If he showed anger, he risked his life. So he stood there, hands at his sides, and watched his child scream for him. This was fatherhood under slavery, a condition that stripped men of the most fundamental aspect of being a father, the ability to protect your children. Historians estimate that between 1790 and 1865, approximately 2 million enslaved men became fathers. 2 million men who loved their children but couldn't defend them, provide for them, or control their futures. 2 million men who experienced fatherhood while enslaved, their paternal authority systematically destroyed by the legal and social structures of slavery. Today we're examining what historical records, first-hand accounts, and contemporary research reveal about enslaved fatherhood. What it meant to be a father when you owned nothing, including yourself, when your children were property, when your ability to protect them was forbidden by law and enforced by violence. This is the story of enslaved fathers, and it's one of the most painful chapters in American history. The legal framework of slavery explicitly denied enslaved fathers any parental rights. In every southern state, laws defined enslaved people as property. Property cannot own property. Therefore, an enslaved man had no legal claim to his children. Court cases from the antebellum period confirm this brutal reality. When enslaved fathers attempted to prevent their children from being sold, courts consistently ruled against them. One South Carolina case from 1847 stated explicitly, "The slave has no legal rights to his offspring. They belong solely to his master." This legal structure had profound practical implications. An enslaved father could not 1. Prevent his child from being sold. 2. Protect his child from punishment. 3. Make decisions about his child's work assignments. 4. Determine his child's living conditions. 5. Prevent his child from being abused. 6. Control his child's future in any way. Historical records show that plantation owners and overseers actively undermined enslaved fathers' authority. This wasn't accidental. It was deliberate policy based on the belief that maintaining total control required breaking down family structures. Overseer journals and plantation management guides from the period explicitly discuss this strategy. One Alabama overseer wrote in 1852, "Never allow the Negro men to discipline their own children. All punishment must come from the overseer." This maintains proper authority structure. The reasoning was clear. If enslaved fathers had authority over their children, it created a competing power structure. Plantation owners wanted enslaved people to understand that all authority flowed from white masters, not from black fathers. This systematic emasculation had devastating psychological effects. Modern research on masculinity and fatherhood shows that the ability to provide for and protect one's children is central to most men's identity across cultures. Enslaved fathers experience this core identity as forbidden and impossible. First-hand accounts from formerly enslaved men describe this anguish. Frederick Douglass wrote, "The father may be the master, but he cannot own his child. The child may be the property of his master, as the calf is the property of the owner of the cow." The relation of master and slave is the only relation recognized by the law. Another man, Henry Bibb, testified, "I loved my child as dearly as any father ever loved. But I had no more power to protect her than if she belonged to someone else. In fact, she did belong to someone else. My love meant nothing to the law." Archaeological evidence from plantation sites reveals how this played out physically. Slave quarter layouts show that families often lived in close proximity, but under constant surveillance. Cabin placement, work schedules, and even mealtimes were designed to maximize control and minimize private family time. The work assignment system further undermined fatherhood. Fathers and children were often assigned to different work gangs, sometimes working in different parts of the plantation. This physical separation during all working hours meant fathers had minimal time with their children. Some plantations deliberately separated fathers from families entirely. If a man was particularly valuable for his skills as a blacksmith, carpenter, or other specialized work, he might be hired out to other plantations or sent to work at distant locations. These separations could last weeks, months, or years. Plantation records document these practices matter-of-factly. A Georgia plantation ledger from 1848 notes, Jim hired to Dawson Plantation for 1 year. Wife and 3 children remain here. Separation necessary for optimal labor allocation. The phrase, separation necessary for optimal labor allocation, describes tearing a father from his children. The casual bureaucratic language makes it more chilling, not less. Economic records reveal that plantation owners viewed these separations purely through a profit lens. If a skilled enslaved man could generate more income hired out elsewhere, his family relationships were irrelevant to the calculation. This wasn't universal. Some plantation owners kept families together, either from paternalistic sentiment or belief that it improved productivity. But the key point is that fathers had no power to determine this. Their family's fate rested entirely on the owner's whims or economic calculations. The psychological impact of this powerlessness is documented in medical literature from formerly enslaved men. Post-emancipation medical examinations noted high rates of what we'd now recognize as depression and PTSD symptoms, often linked to traumatic memories of being unable to protect their children. Perhaps the most traumatic aspect of enslaved fatherhood was being forced to witness violence against children while being prohibited from intervening. Historical records document this as common, even routine. Plantation punishment records show that children as young as 6 or 7 received corporal punishment for infractions, working too slowly, talking back, breaking tools, running away, or simply displeasing the overseer. The punishments included whipping, being locked in confined spaces, food deprivation, and other forms of physical abuse. Enslaved fathers were often present when these punishments occurred. Sometimes they were required to be present, forced to watch as a form of psychological control. Overseer journals describe this practice explicitly. One Louisiana overseer wrote in 1854, "When Negro children require punishment, ensure their fathers witness it." This reinforces proper authority and prevents future resistance from the men. The cruelty of this policy is staggering. It wasn't enough to abuse children. Fathers had to watch helpless, as their authority and identity were destroyed before their eyes. Medical research on trauma helps us understand what this did to these men. Witnessing violence against loved ones while being unable to help creates severe psychological damage. Modern diagnostic criteria for PTSD include witnessing trauma to others as a qualifying traumatic event. Enslaved fathers experienced this not once, but repeatedly, sometimes regularly. First-hand accounts describe the psychological agony. Henry Bibb wrote, "I have stood by and heard the overseer whip my wife and my daughter, and I dare not say a word against it. I have seen my own mother tied to a fence and whipped till the blood ran down her back, and I was not allowed to help her." Another formerly enslaved man, Moses Grandy, testified, "My son was flogged at the post for losing a tool. I was made to hold the light while the driver whipped him. I thought I would die from what I felt inside." Being forced to participate in or facilitate the punishment of his own child, holding a light so the whipping could be seen, represents psychological torture of extraordinary cruelty. The legal system not only permitted this but protected it. If an enslaved father intervened to protect his child, he could be charged with assault on a white person, a crime often punishable by death. The law explicitly protected the right of white overseers and owners to punish enslaved. children while criminalizing parental protection. Court records document cases where enslaved fathers were executed for defending their children. An 1849 Virginia case involved a man named Sam who struck an overseer who was beating his 12-year-old son. Sam was hanged. The overseer faced no charges. The son was sold away from his mother shortly after. These weren't isolated incidents. Legal records from across the South contain similar cases. The message was clear and deliberately sent. Enslaved fathers who tried to protect their children would face the ultimate punishment. This created an impossible situation. Every instinct, every cultural norm, every biological drive told these men to protect their children. But doing so meant death or separation, which would leave the children completely unprotected. The choice was between witnessing abuse while powerless or intervention that would result in worse outcomes. Some men chose intervention anyway. Historical records document cases of enslaved fathers attacking overseers or owners who hurt their children, knowing it meant their own death. These acts of resistance, born of desperation and love, resulted in their execution but became part of the historical record of parental love under impossible circumstances. Most men, however, were forced to stand helpless. Not because they didn't love their children. The historical record makes clear they loved them deeply, but because the system was designed to make protection impossible. The psychological mechanism for coping with this is documented in trauma research. When action is impossible, the mind sometimes dissociates, creating psychological distance from an unbearable reality. Formerly enslaved men described this feeling, being present physically, but having to shut down emotionally to survive witnessing what was happening to their children. This wasn't weakness. It was a survival mechanism in the face of systematic psychological torture designed to break them. Beyond witnessing punishment, enslaved fathers lived under constant threat of permanent separation from their children through sale. Historians estimate that approximately 1/3 of enslaved children were separated from at least one parent through the domestic slave trade. For fathers, this threat created constant psychological stress. Any day, without warning, their children could be sold away. Plantation records document the arbitrary nature of these separation sales driven by owner debt, estate settlements, or simple desire for profit. The domestic slave trade operated across the South through a network of slave traders, auction houses, and newspaper advertisements. These advertisements are preserved in archives, providing chilling evidence of how casually children were sold away from fathers. A typical advertisement from 1852 reads, "For sale, Negro boy, age 10, healthy and strong, good field hand. Mother and father remain on Henderson Plantation. Boy sold to settle debt." The phrase "mother and father remain" acknowledges the family exists only to note they'll be separated. The child's sale to settle debt means a 10-year-old boy was ripped from his father because someone needed money. Fathers had no legal standing to prevent these sales. They could beg, plead, or bargain, but they had no rights. Some plantation owners might be swayed by appeals, others were indifferent or actually enjoyed the power of separating families. First-hand accounts describe fathers witnessing their children being sold. One man testified, "When they put my boy on the block, I tried to buy him. I had saved a little money from hiring out on Sundays. I offered it all. Master laughed at me. Said the boy would bring $800. I had $23. They sold him to a man from Mississippi. I never saw him again." Another man described being sold away from his children. "The trader came for me at dawn. My children were still sleeping. Master said I couldn't wake them to say goodbye. Said it would upset them unnecessarily. I was chained and put in a wagon. I never got to say goodbye to my children. That was 30 years ago. I don't know if they're alive or dead." The systematic separation of fathers from children served economic purposes, but also social control. Plantation owners believed that preventing strong family bonds made enslaved people more manageable, less likely to resist or run away. Breaking father-child bonds was policy, not accident. Demographic studies of plantation records show patterns in these separations. Children aged 8 to 15 were most frequently sold away, as they were old enough to work but young enough to adapt to new situations. This was precisely the age when children needed their fathers most for guidance and protection. The domestic slave trade operated with industrial efficiency. Slave traders moved through regions on regular schedules, purchasing enslaved people and transporting them hundreds of miles to auction markets. Fathers watched their children march away in coffles lines of people chained together, knowing they'd likely never see them again. The geographic distances made reunification after separation nearly impossible. A child sold from Virginia to Louisiana had effectively vanished. No communication systems existed for enslaved people to maintain contact. Literacy was illegal. Travel was forbidden. The separation was designed to be permanent. Some fathers tried to maintain connections across distances through the enslaved community network. Messages might be passed plantation to plantation, trader to trader. Occasionally news would reach a father about his sold child. But these connections were fragile and rare. The psychological impact of these separations is documented in post-emancipation testimonies. Men described decades of not knowing whether their children were alive or dead. The uncertainty compounded the grief. There was no closure, no finality, just endless wondering. After emancipation, thousands of formerly enslaved fathers placed advertisements in newspapers searching for children sold away years earlier. These ads, preserved in archives, are heartbreaking. Searching for my son Thomas, sold from Alabama to somewhere in Texas in 1854. He would be 25 now. I am his father, Moses, now free and living in Montgomery. Most of these searches were unsuccessful. The domestic slave trade had scattered families across thousands of miles. Without records, reunification was nearly impossible. Beyond protection from violence and separation, enslaved fathers could not fulfill another fundamental role: economic provision for their families. They owned nothing. They earned nothing. They could provide nothing. Plantation economic systems ensured this powerlessness. Enslaved people received rations allocated by owners, not wages they could use to provide for families. A father had no ability to secure better food for his children, better clothing, better shelter, or any material improvement in their lives. Historical records show that ration systems were designed around minimal subsistence, not family needs. A typical weekly ration per person consisted of 3 to 4 pounds of salt pork or bacon, 1 peck of cornmeal, occasionally molasses or beans. Children received the same rations as adults, despite needing different nutrition for growth. Fathers couldn't supplement these inadequate rations through purchase because they had no money. They couldn't hunt or fish because they had no time and often no permission. They couldn't grow additional food because they had no land and minimal free time. Some plantations allowed small garden plots where enslaved people could grow vegetables during their limited free time. This required working on Sundays or after dark, following full days of plantation labor. Fathers did this when possible, trying to provide something extra for their families. But the production was minimal and the time cost enormous. Archaeological excavations of slave quarters reveal evidence of these supplementary food production efforts: small garden spaces, fishing hooks made from scavenged metal, crude hunting tools. These findings confirm historical accounts of fathers trying to provide however possible within severe constraints. The clothing system further demonstrated economic powerlessness. Plantation owners provided minimal clothing, typically 2 outfits per year for each person. Fathers couldn't buy their children warmer clothes for winter, new shoes when theirs wore out, or any comfort items. First-hand accounts describe fathers' anguish at seeing children in inadequate clothing. One man testified, "Winter came and my daughter had no shoes. Her feet bled from the cold. I begged master for shoes. He said she could have them in spring with the next allotment. I watched her suffer all winter and couldn't do anything. The inability to provide housing was equally frustrating. Families lived in whatever cabin the plantation assigned. Fathers had no ability to improve housing conditions, expand space for growing families, or provide any housing security. Some enslaved fathers developed specialized skills: carpentry, blacksmithing, masonry, that gave them slightly more leverage. Skilled workers were sometimes allowed to hire themselves out during limited free time, keeping small portions of earnings. These men tried to use whatever money they accumulated to improve their families' lives. But even this was precarious. Owners could revoke permissions at any time. Money accumulated could be confiscated. And the amounts were so small, a few dollars per year at most, that they made minimal difference. Historical records document fathers using these small earnings to buy small comforts for children: a piece of cloth for a dress, a toy, occasionally a book if the child was learning to read secretly. These purchases represented enormous sacrifices, weeks or months of what little money they could earn, spent trying to give their children something, anything. One man described saving for a year to buy his daughter a ribbon for her hair. It cost 25 cents. It took me a year to save that much. When I gave it to her, she cried. Not from joy, she cried because she understood what it meant, that a ribbon was such a treasure. She understood how poor we were, how powerless I was to give her anything more. The psychological impact of being unable to provide for children is well documented in research on masculinity and fatherhood. Across cultures, the provider role is central to paternal identity. Enslaved fathers experience this role as systematically denied. Post-emancipation testimonies frequently mention this powerlessness as among the most psychologically damaging aspects of enslaved fatherhood. One man said, "They could whip me, work me to death, and I bore it. But watching my children go hungry when I couldn't feed them, that broke something in me that never healed." Despite all these constraints, enslaved fathers found ways to fulfill the guidance and teaching aspects of fatherhood. This often occurred in stolen moments, after work, late at night, on Sundays, and required creativity and risk-taking. Fathers taught survival skills essential for life under slavery. Historical accounts describe fathers teaching children how to avoid punishment, how to work efficiently enough to avoid whipping, but not so efficiently that quotas increased, how to read white people's moods, how to stay safe. This knowledge transmission was crucial for children's survival, but deeply painful for fathers to impart. They were teaching children how to survive in slavery, not how to be free. The lessons themselves reinforced the degradation of their situation. One formerly enslaved man recalled, "My father taught me to always say, 'Yes, sir,' and 'No, sir,' to keep my eyes down. To move quickly when called, to show no anger. These lessons saved my life many times. But it hurt him to teach me to be less than a man." Fathers also tried to preserve cultural knowledge and family history. In a system designed to erase identity and history, passing down names of grandparents, origins of the family, African cultural traditions, became acts of resistance. These teaching moments typically occurred at night in cabins after exhausting workdays. Fathers used storytelling to pass down knowledge, often encoding messages and lessons in narratives that could be told openly. For fathers who learned to read, teaching children literacy was perhaps the most significant gift they could give, though it was also the most dangerous. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in most Southern states by 1850. Fathers caught teaching children to read faced severe punishment, and children could be beaten or sold away. Yet historical records document that it happened. Fathers risked everything to give children this tool for future freedom. Former slaves' narratives describe fathers teaching them to read in secret, by candlelight, sometimes using a single book shared across months or years. Frederick Douglass wrote about enslaved fathers who taught literacy. They knew that every letter learned was a step toward freedom. They risked their lives to give their children knowledge that might someday help them escape bondage. Religious instruction was another area where fathers maintained some authority. Many enslaved families held Christian beliefs, often blended with African spiritual traditions. Fathers led family prayers, taught biblical stories, and provided spiritual guidance. This spiritual leadership was significant because it was one area where white authority couldn't completely penetrate. In the privacy of cabins at night, fathers could exercise this form of authority even as all others were denied. Fathers also taught work skills when possible. A father who was a blacksmith might teach his son the trade, hoping it would give him some protection or value that might prevent sale. A father who was a carpenter might teach his son woodworking. These skills were practical gifts that could improve a child's situation within slavery. However, there was always tension in this teaching. Making a child more skilled made them more valuable as property, which might protect them, but also made them more profitable to sell. Fathers had to weigh these impossible calculations. The guidance fathers provided about navigating slavery's dangers was perhaps most crucial. They taught children which overseers were most dangerous, how to avoid attracting negative attention, how to work around the system's worst aspects without triggering punishment. One man recalled, "My father taught me everything that kept me alive, how to read white folks' moods, when to speak and when to stay silent, how to work hard enough, but not too hard." These were lessons in survival that only a father who lived it could teach. This knowledge was passed father to son, father to daughter, through generations. It represented a form of paternal authority that couldn't be completely suppressed, the authority of experience and wisdom about survival. When the Civil War ended slavery in 1865, approximately 2 million formerly enslaved men faced the challenge of establishing fatherhood under freedom. For many, this meant searching for children who had been sold away years or decades earlier. Newspapers in the post-war South ran thousands of advertisements from freedmen searching for family members. A substantial portion came from fathers looking for children. These ads, preserved in archives, provide heartbreaking evidence of separation's scope. "Searching for my children, Sarah, age 19, Thomas, age 16, and William, age 14, sold from South Carolina to somewhere in Louisiana or Mississippi in 1852. I am their father. Isaac Brown, now free and living in Charleston." Most of these searches were unsuccessful. The domestic slave trade had scattered families across vast distances with no records. Even when fathers found their children's general location, reunification often proved impossible due to distance, lack of money for travel, and sometimes children's inability to remember parents they'd been separated from as young children. For fathers who remained with or reunited with their families, emancipation brought the challenge of establishing paternal authority after years of systematic denial. They could now legally protect their children, but the trauma of slavery years didn't disappear. Historical records from the Freedmen's Bureau document the adjustment period. Formerly enslaved fathers sought education for children, negotiated labor contracts to keep families together, and attempted to establish households and economic stability. But the damage from slavery affected these efforts. Many formerly enslaved fathers struggled with what we'd now recognize as PTSD, witnessing years of violence against their children, experiencing powerlessness, and carrying trauma from countless impossible situations, affected their mental health and family relationships. Medical records from the period note high rates of psychological distress among formerly enslaved men. While the medical establishment of the time lacked modern diagnostic frameworks, descriptions match contemporary PTSD symptoms: nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty with emotional regulation, depression. Some fathers, reunited with children after years of separation, found that relationships had to be rebuilt from scratch. Children who had been sold away as youngsters sometimes didn't remember their fathers. The bond had to be established anew, complicated by years of trauma on both sides. Economic challenges compounded the difficulty of establishing fatherhood under freedom. Formerly enslaved people entered freedom with no wealth, no land, no resources. Fathers wanted to provide for families but had minimal means. Many worked as sharecroppers, which recreated many economic conditions of slavery. Despite these challenges, formerly enslaved fathers worked to establish new patterns of fatherhood. They could now legally marry, establishing recognized family structures. They could make decisions about their children's education, work, and futures. They could protect children from violence without fear of legal punishment. The generations born after emancipation grew up with fathers who had legal authority, however limited by poverty and racism. These men passed down stories of what fatherhood had been like under slavery, creating a generational memory of that experience. Research on African American family structures shows patterns that trace directly to slavery's impact. Some formerly enslaved fathers struggled with emotional expression, having learned under slavery to suppress feelings for survival. Some had difficulty with authority and discipline, having watched their own authority systematically destroyed. But the resilience is equally striking. Despite everything slavery did to destroy black fatherhood, fathers maintained bonds with children, passed down cultural knowledge, taught survival skills, and preserved family connections whenever possible. The statistical evidence of this resilience appears in demographic data. After emancipation, formerly enslaved people quickly established formal marriages, reconstituted families separated by slavery when possible, and created stable family structures despite facing poverty and continued racial oppression. Between 1619 and 1865, approximately 2 million enslaved men became fathers. 2 million men who loved their children but couldn't protect them, who wanted to provide but owned nothing, who tried to guide but had no authority, who experienced fatherhood as a constant experience of powerlessness and pain. The systematic destruction of enslaved fatherhood wasn't accidental. It was deliberate policy based on the belief that breaking family structures made people more controllable, more profitable, more fully enslaved. Plantation owners, overseers, and the legal system all worked together to ensure that enslaved fathers had no power to protect, provide for, or control the futures of their children. This wasn't a side effect of slavery. It was central to how the system functioned. The trauma of this experience echoes through generations. Research on African American families shows patterns that trace directly to slavery's assault on fatherhood. The difficulties some men have with emotional expression, with trust and authority structures, with fear of separation, all connect to this history. But what's equally important is the resilience. Despite systematic efforts to destroy black fatherhood, fathers maintained bonds with children. They passed down knowledge, culture, and history. They taught survival skills. They preserved family connections whenever possible. They loved their children even when the system tried to make that love meaningless. After emancipation, formerly enslaved fathers worked to establish new patterns of fatherhood. They searched for separated children. They provided for families despite poverty. They established legal marriages and recognized family structures. They ensured that their children and grandchildren grew up knowing what fatherhood in freedom looked like. The men who survived enslaved fatherhood and those who thrived as fathers after freedom demonstrated extraordinary strength. Not superhuman, they were ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances.